Welcome back to Cozy English, the channel where you learn English naturally, peacefully, while you rest. Tonight's stories are about the world outside, the changing sky, the turning seasons, the rain on a window, the frost on the ground, the way the light shifts from one month to the next. These stories are told by people who notice the natural world around them, who pay attention to it, who are moved by it, who find meaning in its rhythms. As always, you don't need to study or concentrate. Simply listen. Let the words settle around you like leaves falling. Let your body rest while your mind absorbs the language gently, naturally, in its own time. And if this channel helps you learn, please subscribe. It means more stories, more often, for learners just like you. Now close your eyes, take a breath, and let's begin. Story 1, The Last Day of Summer. Rosa noticed it on a Tuesday, in the middle of August. It was a small thing, the kind of thing most people would miss entirely. She was sitting on the back step of her house, drinking a glass of cold water, when she felt it, a faint coolness running through the afternoon heat. Not cold exactly, just a suggestion of something changing, a single thread of autumn woven into the fabric of summer. She had felt this every year for as long as she could remember. The precise moment when summer began, very quietly, to let go. It was never the official date on the calendar. It was always this, a sensation, a shift in the quality of the air, as if the season had reached its peak and was now beginning the slow descent towards the other side. The garden around her was still deeply green and loud with insects. A fat bumblebee moved from flower to flower with its characteristic buzzing industry. Butterflies, two of them, white, spun around each other in a slow, waltzing spiral above the lavender bush. The sun was still hot on her bare arms. But that thread of coolness was there. She was certain of it. She set down her glass and looked up at the sky. Deep blue, cloudless, the kind of sky that belongs absolutely to summer. And yet, there was something in it, some subtle quality of the light, that felt different from July. The sun sat in a slightly different position. The shadows fell at a slightly different angle. It was nothing you could point to and name. It was everything all at once. Rosa had grown up in a house surrounded by countryside, and her mother had taught her to read the seasons the way other parents taught their children to read books. Not with dates or names, but with sensory details. The smell of the air, the sound of the birds, the particular color of the morning light. Summer smells like cut grass and warm stone, her mother had said once. Autumn smells like wet earth and wood smoke. When you can smell the wood smoke but the grass is still green, that is the hinge between the two. Rosa breathed in now, slowly and deliberately. Grass, flowers, the faint sweetness of something overripe, the pear tree at the back of the garden probably. But also, faintly, below everything else, yes, the earth, the deep, cool, dark smell of soil that had begun to exhale. The hinge, she thought. She stayed on the step until the sun dropped behind the roofline and the air became noticeably cooler. Then she went inside and, without quite planning to, made herself a cup of tea rather than another glass of cold water. Summer, she thought, was already saying goodbye. Story 2, Fog. The fog came in on a Wednesday morning in November, and by the time William opened his curtains, the street outside had disappeared entirely. He pressed his face close to the cold glass and looked out. He could see the front path, the gate, the pavement immediately beyond it, and then nothing. White. A soft, dense blankness where the world should have been. The street lamp directly opposite the house was a faint amber smear in the gray. The house on the other side of the road was invisible. He dressed and went downstairs and made porridge, thick with oats and a spoonful of honey, and ate it standing at the kitchen window. The fog had filled the garden as well. He could see the bird feeder. He had hung it close to the house, but the apple tree at the end of the garden was gone. Just the ghost of it, a dark suggestion in the whiteness. The fog did not frighten him. It never had. Instead, it produced in him a kind of pleasurable melancholy. The world was still out there. He knew it was. The road, the houses, the fields beyond the village, all present and accounted for. But the fog hid them, and in hiding them, made them feel not quite real. He put on his coat and hat and went outside. Walking in fog was entirely different from walking in any other kind of weather. Rain announced itself loudly. Wind made its presence known. Snow transformed everything dramatically, but fog simply erased. It removed the familiar world and replaced it with a smaller, quieter one, bounded by visibility, softened at every edge. He walked along the lane that ran behind the houses. He could hear everything with unusual clarity. His own footsteps on the wet gravel, the drip of water from the hedgerow, the distant bark of a dog somewhere beyond the fog. Without the visual landscape to process, his ears worked harder, finding detail in sound. A robin appeared on a fence post to his left. Redbreast vivid against the gray, it regarded him with the particular confident intelligence that robins always seem to possess. Then it dropped from the post and vanished into the hedgerow. He walked for 40 minutes and returned to the house with his coat damp and his cheeks cold and his mind, for the first time in several days, fully quiet. He hung his coat, pulled off his boots, and put the kettle on. The fog was still there when he looked out the window, thick and white and unhurried. It would clear eventually. It always did by midday, burning off in patches until the world emerged again in its ordinary detail. But for now it stayed, and William was glad. Story 3. The River in Winter. The river ran through the town of Breckfield between high stone banks, past the old mill and under the arched bridge and away south towards the estuary. Harriet had grown up beside this river. She had played on its banks as a child, swum in it as a teenager in reckless summer afternoons, and walked beside it almost every day of her adult life. She knew it in every season. She knew its summer face, slow and green and bright, flies skimming its surface, children paddling at the shallows. She knew its autumn face, steel gray and quickening, the leaves falling in from the overhanging trees to be carried swiftly away. And she knew this face, winter, the river in January. It ran high and fast and brown after the recent rain. The banks, which in summer were grassy and gentle, were now steep walls of dark mud, glistening and exposed where the water had risen and fallen. The trees along the bank were bare, their branches making intricate patterns against the white sky. Their roots gripped the bank fiercely, knuckled and ancient. Harriet stood on the bridge and looked downstream. The water was moving with real purpose, not turbulent, not dangerous today, but decisively fast, carrying sticks and leaves and all manner of small debris southward. There was a sound to it, a low, continuous rushing that filled the air around her and made the silence on either side of it feel more silent. A heron stood on a flat rock 20 meters downstream. It was motionless in the way that herons are motionless, absolutely still, yet giving the impression that it could move at any moment with terrible speed. It faced the current, watching the water below it with focused, ancient patience. Harriet watched the heron for a long time. She had once read that herons were considered sacred in some ancient cultures, messengers between this world and another, carriers of secrets from the depths of the water. She did not believe in such things exactly, but standing on the bridge, watching the gray bird hold its impossible stillness above the rushing brown river, she understood why such stories were told. Eventually, without any visible preparation or warning, the heron moved. It struck the water with its beak, a single precise motion, and lifted back into its upright stance so quickly that Harriet blinked and missed it. When she focused again, the heron's bill was empty. It had missed, or perhaps not. Then it raised its great wings and lifted away, clearing the bank on the far side and disappearing beyond the trees in long, slow wing beats. Harriet stayed on the bridge a little longer, watching the place where the heron had been. The rock was just a rock again. The river ran on. She turned and walked home into the wind. Story 4. Snowfall. It began at 10:30 at night, when Jonah was already in bed, but not yet asleep. He heard, or rather felt, the silence deepen. It was a change in the quality of the air rather than a sound, a softening. He got up and went to the window. Snow, already an inch or more on the garden wall, and still falling steadily. Large flakes, unhurried, dropping straight down in the still air. The garden was transformed. The flower beds were smoothed into gentle white mounds. The bird bath had a dome of snow balanced on its rim. The lawn was a blank page. He stood at the window for a long time. He was 44 years old. He had lived through many winters and many snowfalls. He knew perfectly well what snow was. Frozen water, crystallized in various formations as it fell through cold air. He knew that it would cause disruption tomorrow. Slow trains, icy pavements, councils under pressure. He was an adult, and he understood snow as an adult. And yet, standing at the window in the dark, watching the garden fill up with whiteness, he felt something that was not far from wonder. The same feeling he had had as a child on nights like this. The sense that the world had become strange and new, that ordinary things had been made extraordinary by the simple addition of a few centimeters of ice. He went downstairs and put on his boots and coat over his pajamas. He opened the back door. The cold hit him cleanly and completely. He stepped out into the garden and stood still. The snow was falling around him in absolute silence. He looked up, and the snowflakes were coming down out of a sky that was oddly luminous. Not dark, as you would expect at midnight, but a deep, glowing gray, lit from below by the reflected whiteness of the ground. He held out one hand and watched the snowflakes land on his sleeve. Each one was distinct. Each one was perfectly itself for a fraction of a second before it dissolved into a droplet of water against the warmth of his skin. He stood there for several minutes, growing cold, growing peaceful. The only sounds were the impossibly soft sound of snow falling and, somewhere far off, the bark of a fox. He went back inside. He made a cup of hot chocolate, something he almost never did, and sat at the kitchen table with it. The garden outside the window was nearly all white now. The snow was still falling. He stayed up far later than he intended, watching it fall. Story 5. Early Spring. The first green appeared on the 5th of February. Nadia had been watching for it. Every morning she looked out the kitchen window at the flower beds below the back wall, waiting. January had been cold and gray and unchanging. The garden had looked dead, or at least dormant, a collection of bare soil and stubbled stalks and brown leaves. She had thought, not yet, not yet, not yet. But on the 5th of February, she looked out, and there they were, small green spikes pushing up through the earth. Snowdrops, or the beginning of them, Just the tips, just the suggestion, barely visible against the dark soil. But there. She went outside in her slippers and knelt on the wet grass to look more closely. Yes, definitely. The snowdrops were coming. And now that she was looking, now that she was down here, this close to the ground, she could see other things too. A rosette of new leaves on one of the hardy geraniums. Something tiny and pale in the hedge, which might be catkins beginning to form. The tiniest possible bulge of green on what had looked like a completely dead hydrangea stem. Life. Life was returning. She sat back on her heels and looked up at the sky. It was white and cold, but the light was different from January light. It was a little higher, a little brighter, reaching the garden at a slightly wider angle. The days were lengthening. Slowly, incrementally, they had been lengthening since December, and now, in early February, you could actually feel it. There was light at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Pale, thin light, but light. Nadia was not a particularly sentimental person. She thought of herself as practical, grounded, realistic. But something happened to her every year at this precise moment. This first undeniable sign of the turning, that she could not quite explain rationally. It felt like hope, not the anxious, effortful kind of hope that you had to work to maintain. The other kind, the kind that simply existed, like warmth from the sun, present, quiet, requiring nothing of you. She went back inside, her slippers wet through, her knees damp from the grass. She changed her socks, made coffee, and stood at the window looking at the small green spikes in the flower bed below the wall. They had not moved. Of course they had not moved. But she kept checking, happily, throughout the day. Story 6. The Oak Tree. The oak tree in the field behind Marcus's house was 300 years old. He knew this because a local historian had told him when he first moved to the village, and he had not forgotten it. 300 years. It had been there when the field was plowed by hand, when the village had no electricity, no running water, when people traveled by foot and horse. It had been there when Marcus's great-great-grandparents were born, and their grandparents before them. It would likely be there long after Marcus was gone. He visited it often. He could see it from his bedroom window, a large, dark shape at the edge of the field, and in all seasons it looked different enough that it never became entirely familiar. In spring, it burst into a pale, shimmering green that was almost yellow. The new leaves were small and tender, and when the light came through them from behind, the whole tree seemed to glow. In summer, it was massive and dark and absolute, an enormous presence that cast deep shade across the grass below. Birds nested in its branches. Insects lived in its bark. It was an ecosystem unto itself. In autumn it turned, not all at once. Trees never turn all at once. It turned gradually, leaf by leaf, section by section, over the course of 6 weeks or more, moving through shades of green and gold and brown and copper. When the wind blew in October, the leaves fell in long, spiraling streams. They piled up beneath the tree in drifts that smelled of soil and rain and something older than either. And now, in February, it was bare. The branches spread against the white sky in perfect complexity, a fractal pattern of division and subdivision, each branch splitting into smaller branches, those into twigs, the twigs into the smallest possible filaments, the whole vast system readable as an upward spread of dark lines. You could see, in the structure of it, the logic of trees, the way growth organizes itself outward and upward towards light, dividing and redividing to maximize contact with the sky. Marcus stood at the fence and looked at it in its winter state. There was something about a bare tree that felt honest. Stripped of its leaves, stripped of its season, it showed you exactly what it was. The architecture was visible. The structure that held the whole thing up, that had held it up for 3 centuries through every storm and drought and season, there it was, in plain view. He placed his hand against the bark, rough and furrowed and deeply patterned, almost like fabric woven by enormous hands, warm, slightly, in a way that surprised him, the wood holding the thin February sun. He stayed there for a long time. Story 7. The Tide. The sea at Aldwych Bay went out a very long way. At low tide, the water retreated so far that the beach seemed to double in size, exposing a great expanse of wet sand and shallow pools left behind between the sandbars. At high tide, the sea came in close to the shingle bank, and the small wooden groins stood half submerged, black and glistening. Philippa had been coming here with her father since she was a child. He had taught her to read the tide tables, how to look up the times and heights, how to plan a walk around what the sea would be doing, how to respect the water's schedule rather than imposing her own. "The tide doesn't care about you," he had said, not unkindly. "It runs on its own time. Your job is to pay attention." He was gone now, had been gone for 4 years, and she still came to the beach, and she still paid attention. This morning the tide was going out. She had arrived at high water and was now walking as the sea retreated, following it back across the sand. The wet sand was firm beneath her feet, perfectly smooth where the water had flattened everything. She could see her own footprints behind her, a clean trail of oval shapes leading back to where she had started. Ahead, the line of the water was a long, low crease of white foam on pale sand, rippling and receding with each small wave. The sound of the sea was the most constant sound she knew, neither loud nor quiet but permanently present, a sound that underlay everything and never stopped. She found a pool between 2 low ridges of sand and crouched to look into it. The pool was perhaps 30 centimeters deep and completely clear. She could see the rippled sand at the bottom and several small translucent creatures moving slowly through the water. Shrimps, she thought, or very small crabs. A piece of dark seaweed drifted in the tiny current. She stayed crouched at the pool for several minutes, watching. There was an entire small world here, left behind by the tide, going about its business in the shallow water until the sea returned. She stood and walked on. The light on the water was extraordinary this morning, a low, pale winter light that came in from the southeast at a flat angle and turned everything silver. The wet sand reflected the sky. The shallow water was the color of polished tin. Where a wave broke and spread thin across the flat beach, it left a momentary mirror before it soaked away. She walked for an hour, until the sea had retreated to its farthest point and the beach was at its widest. Then she turned and walked back, the sea already beginning to return behind her, the tide turning in its patient, inexorable way. By the time she reached the shingle bank, the footprints she had made on the way out were gone, covered by the returning water. She sat on the dry shingle and looked at the sea. Her father, she thought, would have liked this morning. He always liked a clear winter day, with good light and a tide that behaved itself. "Not bad," she said aloud, to no one, or perhaps to him. The sea came in. Story 8. Thunderstorm. The storm arrived in the early afternoon without much warning, or rather, with all the warning in the world, if you knew how to read it. The morning had been hot for June, unusually hot. the kind of heat that sat in the air like something solid, pressing down. By 11 o'clock, it had been too warm to be comfortable, and the sky, which had started clear and blue, had been slowly filling in from the west with large cumulus clouds, towering white formations that built and built throughout the morning, rising higher and higher until by noon they had reached the top of the visible sky. And then they darkened, from white to cream to gray to an extraordinary blue-green color that Eleanor had always found both beautiful and faintly alarming. The light changed. The sky to the west went the color of a bruise. She stood in the garden watching the clouds build and said, aloud, "Here it comes." The first sound of thunder was low and distant, a long, rolling rumble from the west that you felt as much as heard. The birds, she noticed, had gone completely silent. A moment ago the garden had been full of their sound. Now there was nothing. Even the insects seemed to have paused. The wind picked up. It came in a long, cool gust that bent the tall plants sideways and lifted the leaves on the apple tree to show their pale undersides. The temperature dropped perceptibly. After the heavy heat of the morning, the cold air was extraordinary. It smelled of rain and electricity and something sharp that she had once heard called petrichor, the smell that earth produces in anticipation of rain. She went inside. The first raindrops hit the window as she closed the back door. Large, isolated drops that appeared as dark circles on the patio slabs. Then more. Then suddenly, all at once, it was raining heavily and completely. A roar of water on the glass, on the roof, on the garden, filling everything with noise. Lightning. A white-blue flash that lit the kitchen briefly and absolutely. She counted. 1, 2, 3, 4. Thunder. The storm was 4 miles away, moving closer. Eleanor had always loved thunderstorms. As a child, she had watched them from her bedroom window, counting the seconds between lightning and thunder, feeling both frightened and thrilled. She still felt both things, slightly, even now. There was something about the scale of a thunderstorm that made you feel, pleasurably, very small. She made tea and sat at the kitchen table and watched the storm through the window. Lightning and thunder came in closer succession now. The storm was overhead. The rain on the window was so heavy that she could barely see the garden. It was transformed. The familiar green shape of it dissolved into motion and gray, the plants bending under the force of the rain, the lawn becoming glossy with water. And then, as quickly as it had built, it began to ease. The thunder moved eastward, growing distant again. The lightning came less frequently. The rain softened to a steady, companionable pattern on the glass. The sky to the west showed a strip of lighter gray. Eleanor looked out at the garden. Everything was soaked and gleaming. The plants, which had been heavy and limp with heat in the morning, were upright again. The air, when she opened the back door a crack to test it, was cool and clean and extraordinary. The first bird sang, a blackbird, tentative and then more confident. Others joined it. The evening sounds began to return. She went outside and walked across the wet grass in her socks, which she knew was impractical and didn't care at all. Story 9. Autumn Migration. In October, the swallows left. Daniel had been watching them for weeks. They had arrived in April, as they always did, and spent the summer swooping and darting over the fields behind the village, skimming the surface of the pond, filling the evenings with their sharp, musical calls. They nested in the old barn at the edge of his property, had done so for as long as he could remember, and probably for decades before he was born. He could see the mud cups of their nests from the barn door, neat, compact structures tucked against the rafters, held to the wood by instinct and craft. In July and August, he had watched them teach their young to fly. The juveniles had been uncertain at first, their movements less fluid, their angles less precise than the adults. But within days they had learned. By August, they were indistinguishable from their parents in flight. Then September came, and they began to gather. He noticed it first as a change in their behavior. They had always swept widely over the land, individual birds or pairs covering the fields in long arcs. Now they began to congregate. He would see them massed on the telephone wires in the morning, dozens of them, perhaps more, lined up in rows, a living garland strung between the poles. They murmured. They shifted and settled and shifted again. "Getting ready," his neighbor Anne had said one morning when they met at the gate. She had lived here all her life and watched the swallows every year. "When do you think they'll go?" Daniel asked. She looked at the sky, then at the wire. "Few more days," she said, "when the weather comes in." She was right. The weather came in on a Tuesday, a band of rain and cold from the north, and when Daniel looked out on Wednesday morning, the wires were empty. He walked to the barn. The nests were there, still attached to the rafters, but the birds were gone. Thousands of miles away by now, or beginning to be, moving south through France and Spain and across the Mediterranean, across the Sahara, down into sub-Saharan Africa, following routes that had been followed for millions of years, finding their way by means that science understood imperfectly and that still, in some lights, seemed miraculous. He stood in the barn for a long time. The nests were perfect. They would be here next April. The birds would find them, these same birds, returning to the same barn, the same rafters, the same squares of sky outside the same barn door. He had read that swallows return to their birthplace with extraordinary accuracy, not just to the right country, the right region, the right village, to the right building, the right rafter. He would be here when they came back. He intended to be here when they came back. He walked out of the barn and looked up at the empty wire. The sky was pale and wide. Somewhere to the south, the swallows were in it. Story 10. The Last Frost. The last frost of winter came on the 23rd of March, 2 days after the official start of spring. Constance knew it was the last frost. She could not have explained how she knew. She simply woke at 5 in the morning with a certainty about it, went to the window and saw the garden glittering in the first gray light. Every blade of grass, every leaf, every surface crystallized in white. By 9 o'clock it had melted. The sun came up strong and warm for March, and the frost dissolved quickly, leaving everything freshly wet and bright. The temperature climbed steadily. By 11 it felt like a spring day without qualification, mild, bright, carrying a faint warmth in the sun that you could feel on your face if you turned towards it. Constance spent the day in the garden. She had been waiting for this, for the last frost, for the signal that the ground was ready. She had seedlings on the windowsill inside, tomatoes, courgettes, sweet peas, cosmos, a dozen little pots of promise that had been sitting in the light and growing leggy, waiting to be planted out. Not yet, she had told them each time she passed. Wait. But now she carried the pots out into the garden one by one and set them on the wall while she prepared the beds. She turned the soil. It was soft after the winter rain and worked easily, turning over in dark, damp clods. She added compost from the heap at the corner and worked it in. She raked it flat. She planted the sweet peas first, along the fence where she had put in the wire support in autumn. Then the cosmos, in groups along the border. Then, in the raised bed near the house, the courgettes and the first of the tomatoes. It took most of the afternoon. By 4 o'clock the sun was lower and the warmth had faded, and Constance was tired and her knees ached and her hands were dark with soil. She stood and looked at what she had done. The garden, which an hour ago had been bare and organized, was now dotted with small green plants. Fragile-looking, tentative, they had spent their entire short lives indoors on a windowsill, and now here they were in real soil under a real sky. She watered them gently, long, slow circuits with the watering can, letting the water soak in rather than run off. Then she gathered her tools and went inside. She washed her hands at the kitchen sink, watching the dark soil dissolve under the warm water. Outside the window, the garden was still. The small plants were still. The sky was turning amber in the west. She felt the particular satisfaction of work done in the right season, at the right time, in accord with something larger than herself. She had watched and waited and read the signs and acted when the moment was right. The garden would grow. Spring was beginning. Story 11. Midsummer Night. In June, the nights were short, very short. In the north of Scotland, where Agnes lived, there was hardly any darkness at all around midsummer. The sun set after 10 in the evening and rose again before 4 in the morning. In between, the sky never went truly dark. It hovered in a deep blue twilight, what the Scots called the gloaming, a luminous half-night that lasted only a few hours before the light returned. Agnes had grown up with this. To her it was normal. But every year, when her sister Moira came to visit from London, Moira was bewildered by it. "It's 11:30 at night," Moira said, standing at the kitchen window, looking at the sky that still held the last light of the sun. "It shouldn't look like this." "It shouldn't look like what?" Agnes said. "Like it's still afternoon." Agnes looked at the sky, pale gold in the west, deepening to indigo in the east. The hills across the loch dark against the light, their outlines soft. A single star, the brightest, which would be Venus, visible near the horizon. "It's not still afternoon," Agnes said. "It's its own thing. It's the gloaming." Moira pressed her nose against the glass like a child. "I'll never get used to it. I'll never stop liking it," Agnes said. They went outside. The air was cool and smelled of heather and the loch. The water was absolutely still, no wind tonight, and reflected the sky perfectly, so that you seemed to be standing between two skies, the real one above and its double below. The hills, too, had their reflection in the water. Everything was doubled, the world made symmetrical by stillness. They walked along the track that ran beside the loch, neither of them talking much. There was a quality to the light that discouraged talking, not oppressively, not forbiddingly, but as if talk were simply unnecessary. The night, if you could call it night, provided its own conversation. An owl called from somewhere in the trees on the slope above them, not a question and answer call, just a single, long note that fell away into the silence. "Did you hear that?" Moira whispered. "Tawny owl," Agnes said. They stood still and listened. The owl called again, from a different direction, or perhaps there were two of them, talking to each other in the half-light. They walked back to the house at midnight. The sky in the north was still pale, still holding the last of the sun. Agnes put the kettle on, and they sat in the kitchen and drank tea and talked quietly until 1:30, when the sky outside finally, slightly, darkened. "I could live here," Moira said sleepily. "You could," Agnes said. "I'd never sleep, though." "You get used to it," Agnes said, though she wasn't entirely sure this was true. She had grown up here, and she still sometimes lay awake in June, looking at the pale ceiling lit by the luminous sky outside, unable to tell her body it was night. She did not, in those moments, particularly mind. Story 12. The Changing Light. The thing that Patrick noticed most, as the seasons turned, was the light. Not the temperature, not the leaves or the flowers or the birds. Those things were obvious, dramatic, easy to name. What struck him most every year was subtler than any of those things. The way the quality of the light changed, the angle of it, the color of it, the weight of it. In January, the light was thin and cautious. It came from low on the horizon even at noon, raking in at a shallow angle, casting long shadows even from small objects. It was a pale light, a cold light, a light that lit the world without warming it. Beautiful in its own way, it showed you the structure of things, the texture of bark and stone and earth, lit from the side, but provisional, light on loan. By March, something shifted. The light came in a little higher, a little brighter. It was still cold light, spring light, not summer light, but it had more confidence. You could feel the sun, faintly, on your face. The shadows were a little shorter. At 4 in the afternoon, there was still light. This felt, every year, like a gift. May light was exuberant. It came early and left late, and in between it was everywhere, filling the garden from above and from the sides, pouring through the new leaves of the trees in green gold waves, lying flat and warm on every surface. May light made everything look lit from within. Summer light, July and August, was high and hot and direct. It was useful light, not particularly subtle. It showed things without mystery. What it offered instead was generosity, an abundance of bright hours, a long ease, the sense of time expanding in the warmth. And then, from August onwards, the change began. Not a sudden change. Nothing in the seasons was ever sudden, just a gradual subtraction, the light leaving earlier each evening, arriving a little later each morning, the angle dropping degree by degree. September light was golden, warm, long-shadowed. October light was amber, slanted, extraordinarily beautiful in the way of things ending. November light was the strangest. Some days it was dark all day, solid gray cloud, no sun visible, just a flat, directionless illumination that made it impossible to tell the time. But on the clear days, the light came so low and so sideways that it transformed everything. A hedgerow in November light was not just a hedgerow, it was a detailed study in texture, every twig and berry and spider's web picked out in gold. Patrick kept a journal of the light. He had been doing so for 6 years. He didn't write much, just a line or two each day about what the light was doing, what it fell on, what it revealed. Reading back through the journals, he could reconstruct any year's seasons with some precision. He could tell you what the light had looked like on any given day in any given month. He had been asked more than once why he did this. He thought about it seriously before answering. "Because it's always changing," he said eventually. "And if you don't write it down, you forget what it was like. You think you'll remember. You don't." He was sitting at the window now, in the early morning, the journal open on the table beside him. The light was doing something particular. Winter morning light, pale and sideways, coming through the bare branches of the tree outside and making a pattern of shadows on the opposite wall that shifted very slowly as the sun moved. He picked up his pen. January 16th, clear after frost. Sun on the east wall at 8 a.m., long branch shadows moving almost imperceptibly southward. Everything lit from the side, every surface textured. The winter light shows the world's bones. He put the pen down and looked at the light on the wall. It was already, very slightly, changing. Story 10. The First Snow. She had grown up somewhere that had reliable snow in winter, and had moved, as an adult, somewhere that rarely had it, and she had not expected to miss it as much as she did. The snow had been, in childhood, the transformation of the ordinary. The same street, the same garden, but covered and quieted and made new. She had woken to it on winter mornings with a feeling that was specific to snow. The possibility that things would be different today, that the ordinary day might be canceled in favor of something else. The first snow of a winter still produced something in her that she could not entirely account for. A quickening, a return. She was not a child anymore, and the possibilities of a snow day were no longer hers, but the quickening came anyway, from somewhere in the body that was still the child who had stood at the window watching the flakes fall. She thought of it as a form of continuity. The adult who stood at the window and felt the quickening contained the child who had stood there before. This was one of the gifts of the physical world, its consistency across the years. Snow felt like snow, regardless of the years between. Story 11. The Spring Bulbs. He had planted the bulbs in October, in the part of the garden where the light was best, and had spent the winter watching the ground for signs that he knew were not visible yet, and looking anyway. The first green had appeared in February, a small point pushing through the soil that could have been anything but wasn't. He had watched it with the same attention he gave to things that were happening rather than waiting to happen. By April, the bulbs had become flowers, and the flowers had changed the garden in the way flowers change things, suddenly and completely, as if the garden that had existed before the flowers was a different garden, or perhaps the garden's true self, which had only been temporarily withheld. He had been planting bulbs for 8 years. The cycle was familiar. October's planting, November's waiting, February's first signs, April's flowering. It was familiar, and it was not diminished by familiarity. He looked forward to October with genuine anticipation, as if the cycle were always new. He thought this was one of the things gardens gave you, the practice of waiting, and the reward of the thing waited for, and the return of the waiting the following year. He was glad to have the cycle to participate in. Story 12. The Autumn Walk. She walked in the park every Sunday in autumn because autumn in the park was her favorite thing about the year. The park in autumn was the light, which came in low and long and turned everything amber and bronze. It was the smell of the fallen leaves, which she could not have described but would have recognized anywhere. It was the sound of the leaves underfoot, which she did not try to avoid but specifically sought. She had been walking in the park in autumn since childhood, and the walk had not lost anything. She sometimes thought it had gained, that the years had added to the walk a quality of accumulation, of all the previous autumn walks layered under the present one. She was not only walking in the park in October, she was also walking in all the October walks she had taken before. The park was the same park. The light was the same light. She was not the same person. She was glad to be the person she was now, in the park, with all the previous autumns available to her. Story 13. The River in Flood. She had seen the river in flood only twice in her life, and both times she had stood and watched it for much longer than she had intended. The flood changed the river's character completely. The usual river was quiet and navigable, with visible banks and a pace that invited contemplation. The flood was none of these things. It was fast and brown and full of things it had picked up along the way. Branches, debris, the occasional object that had no business being in a river. It filled its banks and exceeded them, and made its presence known. She was not frightened by the flood. She was fascinated by it, by the same river being entirely different from itself. She thought about what it was: more water, more quickly, more than the channel had been designed to hold, the river being more than itself. She had come back the following week when the levels had dropped and the usual river had returned, and she had stood in the same place and looked at the same water. It was quieter and calmer, and it had retained nothing of the flood except the height of the mark it had left on the bank. She thought about this sometimes when something large had passed: the mark on the bank, the return to the usual level, the river, again, being itself. Story 14. The Garden in Winter. She kept gardening in winter, which surprised people who thought the garden was seasonal. The winter garden was different from the other seasons' gardens. The work was different, less growing and more tending, more clearing, the preparation that made the spring possible. There was less color and more structure, the shapes of things that were dormant but not gone. She had found, in the years of gardening through winter, that she liked the winter garden in a way she had not expected. It required a different quality of attention. You had to look more carefully, and what you found was less dramatic but still real. The evergreen that held its color when everything else had gone, the bare branches with their structural elegance, the first small bulb points in January that you had to be looking for to see. The winter garden taught her that all of it, the whole year, was the garden, not only the flowering parts. The dormant months were the garden too, doing what dormancy required, preparing for what would come. She went out into it even in the cold. She came back inside cold and damp and satisfied in the particular way of someone who has been paying attention. Story 15. The Bird That Arrived Every Year. For 11 years, a particular type of bird had appeared in her garden in March, and she had never been certain whether it was the same bird or a different bird following the same route. She had read, eventually, that some birds did return to the same gardens year after year. Others of the same species followed the same migratory routes, arriving in the same places, but were not individually the same bird. Without a ring, she could not know. She had decided she didn't need to know. What she knew was that the bird arrived in March, reliably, and that its arrival told her spring was beginning. This was the information she needed. The bird was the messenger regardless of whether it was the same messenger. She had come to think of certain events in nature as personal: the March bird, the specific tree in the park that turned first in autumn, the particular corner of the river where the light was good in late afternoon. These were not actually personal. The natural world did not direct itself at individual humans, but the consistency of certain things over the years made them feel personal, in the way that a familiar route felt personal without belonging to anyone. She waited for the bird each year. It always came. Story 16. The Garden She Inherited. She had moved into the house and inherited a garden that had been established over 40 years by the previous owner, and that she had not, initially, known what to do with. The garden was specific in the way of old gardens. It had things in it she could not have chosen: the mature trees, the existing beds, the particular arrangement that had been arrived at over decades. She had two choices: manage what was there or change what was there. She had managed what was there, mostly, because the scale of the change required to make it her garden would have required removing things that had taken 40 years to grow, and she had not wanted to remove them. Over the years, she had added her own things, carefully, in the spaces the existing garden offered. The tulip bulbs in the bed where there was a gap, the climbing rose against the fence that had looked bare, the herb planting near the kitchen door. The garden was now partly hers and partly the previous owner's, and she thought this was fine. The previous owner had made something that sustained her. She was making something that would sustain whoever came next. The garden was longer than any individual who kept it. Story 17. The Ice on the Path. She had walked on the same path for 5 years and had never seen it iced over until the particular January when it was, and the ice had made the familiar strange. The path under ice was recognizably the same path and also completely different. She could not walk it in the usual way. She had to attend to it with a focus she never applied in ordinary conditions. The slow step, the weight distribution, the constant assessment of the surface. She had found this interesting rather than frustrating. The path was asking her to pay a different kind of attention. She could not walk while thinking about other things, which was how she usually walked on this path. The ice required her to be fully present to where she was. She had arrived at the end of the path and back home safely, having paid closer attention to this familiar path than she had in 5 years. She had noticed things she had walked past without seeing: the fence post that had been replaced, the tree that was leaning more than she had remembered, the light on the wet stones. She thought about this sometimes when things that were familiar became, temporarily, unfamiliar. The strangeness was an opportunity to see again what habit had made invisible. Story 18. The Changing Light. She was attentive to the light in a way she had not always been, and could not entirely explain. She noticed when the evenings began to stay lighter in February, the specific quality of the change, not brighter exactly, but longer, the last light still present at the end of the day when it had been dark for months at that hour. She noticed the different quality of light in summer evenings when it was golden and long, and the quality in October when it came in low and flat through the windows and made shadows that were specific to the season. She did not photograph the light much. She found that photographing things took her out of the seeing and into the recording, and the recording was not the point. The point was the seeing. Light was the one aspect of the natural world that was everywhere and unavoidable, and she had found, once she began paying attention to it, that the attention made her more present to wherever she was. The light was always doing something. If she looked, she could see what it was doing. She had come to think of light attention as one of her practices, the daily noticing of what the light was, which was one way of noting where in the year she was and what the day had to offer. Story 19. The Same Walk, Different Walk. She had been walking the same circuit in the park for several years and had never had the same walk twice. She had thought about this and could not entirely explain it. The route was identical, the same gates, the same paths, the same loop back. But the walk was always different. The light was different. The season determined what she could see. What she was thinking about determined what she noticed. Her state determined how the walk felt. She had found the same walk to be beautiful, ordinary, melancholy, joyful, meditative, distracted, restoring, insufficient. The walk accommodated all of these. The walk gave back what she brought to it, transformed by the particular quality of the day. She thought this was what the natural world did, consistently. Received what you brought and gave it back, changed by the light and the air and the movement and the season. The same walk was never the same because you were never the same and the world was never the same, and the meeting of the two produced something new each time. She walked the circuit regularly and intended to continue. Each walk was the same walk. Each walk was a different walk. She found this unresolvable paradox satisfying. Story 20. The Garden in Rain. She went into the garden in light rain, when she could, because the garden in rain was different from the garden in sun, and the difference was interesting. The sounds changed. The soft, percussive sound of rain on different surfaces, the leaves, the stones, the compost bin. The smells changed. The soil released something in rain that was specific to wet earth, and which she liked unreservedly. The colors became more vivid, the greens greener, the stone darker. She had been told, as a child, that rain was the weather to avoid. She had learned, as an adult, that the avoidance was a matter of being dressed incorrectly. With the right boots and jacket, rain was not a problem to be avoided, but a different version of the same world. She had come to prefer certain things in rain: the garden, the walk along the canal, the view from the window. The rain version of these things had a quality the dry version did not, and she did not want to have seen only one version of a thing she loved. Story 21. The Night Sky. He had moved to the city as a young man and had not thought about the night sky for years, until he had spent a week in the countryside and had looked up. The country sky was a different sky from the city sky. The city sky was aglow at the edges, a handful of bright stars visible through the light pollution. The country sky was crowded, dense with stars in a way he had forgotten was possible, or had perhaps never known properly as an adult. He had stood in a field for 30 minutes simply looking. He had been moved by this in a way that surprised him. He was not a particularly spiritual person, and the response to the sky was not spiritual exactly. It was more like scale, the sudden apprehension of the size of the thing he was in, which the city had been occluding for years. He had gone back to the city and the city sky, but he had changed how he thought about sky, about the light that hid the light. He had thought about the density of stars that were always there, even when they were not visible. The invisibility was a condition of where he lived, not a condition of the sky. He tried to find a dark place occasionally and look up, to remember what was always there, whether or not he could see it. Story 22. The Sea in Winter. She had visited the sea in winter for the first time as an adult, after years of visiting only in summer, and had found it completely different and had preferred it. The winter sea was empty, or nearly. A few dog walkers, occasionally someone like herself who had come simply to be there. The beach had its full extent, the sand unoccupied, the light low and gray and wide. The sea itself was the same sea, but in winter it felt more itself, less accommodating, less managed, doing what it did without any concern for whether the weather was suitable. She had walked along the winter beach for an hour with her coat against the wind and had felt the particular quality of wide empty space. The sky above the sea was enormous, unobstructed by anything. She had felt small in a way that was not frightening but clarifying, the reminder of the size of things against which she was very small. She had gone back the following winter, and the winter after that. The summer sea remained what it had been, crowded, warm, a pleasure. The winter sea was its own thing, and she needed both. Story 23. The Compost. He had started composting 5 years ago and had found it, unexpectedly, one of the more satisfying things he did regularly. The compost required almost nothing of him: the vegetable scraps, the garden waste, the coffee grounds, in the bin at the bottom of the garden. He turned it occasionally, he added materials, he waited. The waiting was the point. The pile took the raw material and, without his active involvement, transformed it. The scraps became something that was excellent for the garden, dark and rich and full of the things growing things needed. He could not have manufactured this transformation by effort. He could only provide the conditions and wait. He thought about the compost when he thought about things that required time rather than effort. The impatience he sometimes felt with the pile was instructive. The pile was going at the pace it went, and the wanting it to go faster would not make it go faster. It would be ready when it was ready. He used the compost on the garden, and the garden showed the effect. The round was satisfying in this way. The kitchen scraps, the transformation, the garden, the kitchen. The circle, repeated. He found it calming to participate in. Story 24. The Tree. The tree at the end of the street had been there, he had been told, for more than 100 years. He thought about this sometimes when he walked past. The tree had been there when the houses on the street were new, when they were young, when they became old. It had been through more winters than any of the current residents and all of their parents. It had outlasted everyone who had walked past it in the first 50 years of its life. He was very aware that the tree was indifferent to this history. The tree did not know it was 100 years old. The tree was doing what the tree did, in the way it had always done it. The history was something he was projecting onto it, because he was a creature of time, and the tree helped him feel the length of time he usually didn't think about. He liked that the tree was there. He liked that it would be there after him. He liked the continuity it represented, the unchanging presence of a living thing in the changing neighborhood, the slowness of it against the quickness of everything else. He walked past it and looked at it when he remembered to. He was trying to remember more often. Story 25. The First Day of Autumn. She had a particular relationship with the first day of autumn that she had not planned. The first day, not the calendar date, but the day when the quality of the light had definitively changed, when you could feel the shift in the air, produced something in her that was difficult to name. A small release, perhaps. A settling. She had tried to understand it. She was not someone who suffered in the heat. She liked summer well enough. She was not someone who particularly needed the darker months. And yet the first day of autumn arrived with a quality she welcomed, a sense that the year was entering its more serious half. She thought perhaps it was the contrast. Summer had a slightly demanding quality, the long days, the light that persisted, the expectation of being outdoors and social and productive in summer ways. The first day of autumn released the demand. Things were permitted to slow. The evenings could be internal. The pace could change. She met it every year. She noticed it every year. She felt, each time, a small and reliable gladness that she had made it to autumn again. Story 26. The Frost. The first frost of the year transformed the garden in a way she never quite got used to. The frost arrived overnight, without announcement, and by morning everything was white. Not the snow white that covered things, but the frost white that outlined them. Each leaf edge, each blade of grass, each cobweb in the corner of the fence, made suddenly visible by the coating of ice. She stood at the window each time and looked before going out. The frosted garden was geometrical in a way the summer garden never was. The structure of things appeared, the branching of the rose, the architecture of the dormant perennial, the web she had not noticed until the frost made it a tracery of white. She went out into it and the grass crunched under her feet, and the cold was immediate, and she stayed longer than she needed to. She liked the cold of it, the silence of a frosted morning, the way the world felt suspended. By mid-morning the frost was gone, melted by the low winter sun, and the garden was its ordinary self again. She had been awake to see it. This was enough. Story 27. The Sound of Summer. She had a particular memory of the sound of summer, the specific quality of an afternoon in June, when the windows were open and the sounds of the outside came in. The lawnmower somewhere, the birds, the distant children, the general easy hum of a warm day. This sound existed for a limited period. By late July, it was too hot and the hum was different. By September, it was something else entirely. But June, specifically the early afternoon of June, had a sound she had known all her life and that arrived each year with the certainty of something returning. She kept the windows open on those afternoons specifically to hear it. She found a reason to be at home in the early afternoon in June when the weather was good. She sat where she could hear the garden and the street and the birds, and she let the sound fill the room. She could not have recorded the sound. It was too general for a single microphone to capture. But she did not need to record it. It came back every year, and she came back to it, and the meeting was one of the pleasures she counted on. Story 28. The Mud. She had learned to be pragmatic about mud, which had taken longer than she would have liked. The mud was an unavoidable feature of the wet months, and the wet months were a substantial portion of the year in the place she lived. She had spent years either avoiding walks during muddy periods or taking them and being unhappy about the mud, the weight of it on her boots, the mess, the way it slowed everything down. She had got better boots and had changed her relationship with mud. The better boots handled it. Once the boots handled it, the mud was simply the condition of the path in wet weather, the path being exactly what it was, doing what paths did in November. She had found, once the mud was handled, that the muddy walk had its own quality. The landscape was different wet, the colors deeper, the air cleaner, the light softer. She had been missing this by avoiding the conditions. She went out in the mud now and came back with it on her boots and dealt with it and thought nothing of it. She had found this extended. There were other things she had been avoiding because of manageable inconvenience. The gear, the preparation, the post-activity management. In many cases, the inconvenience was a one-time purchase or a small habit, and the thing beyond it was worth having. Story 29. The Migrating Birds. She had stood at the estuary in October and watched thousands of birds moving across the sky, and the watching had been one of the most affecting things she had seen. She had not expected it. She had gone to the estuary for a walk, and had happened to be there during the migration, and the migration had been happening whether or not anyone was there to see it. She was there. She had seen it. The birds moved in formations that changed constantly. The shapes of them against the sky, the turns and contractions and expansions, the way thousands of individual creatures moved as if they were one continuous thing. She had stood still for a long time, her walk forgotten. She had thought, this happens every year, and has happened every year, and I have not been here to see it. She was not reproaching herself. She was simply aware of the scale of what was continuously occurring in the world without her noticing. The migration was happening. The seasons were changing. The natural world was moving through its cycles, independent of whether she attended. She had found, since that afternoon, that attending was worth the effort. Not everything. She could not attend to everything, but some things, specifically and on purpose, because what she had seen by showing up was worth the showing up. Story 30. The Same View in Different Seasons. She had a view from her window that she had been looking at for 7 years, and she had found it most interesting to look at the same view across seasons. The view was a garden and a row of trees beyond the fence. In spring, the trees had blossom and then leaves, and the garden had its earliest color. In summer, the trees were full, and the garden was dense and green. In autumn, the trees changed color before they lost their leaves, and the sequence of colors across the weeks was reliably surprising. In winter, the trees were bare and the garden was minimal, and the view went further because the leaves were gone. She had looked at this view thousands of times. She had noticed it becoming familiar, and then, in the noticing, had made the effort to keep seeing it rather than merely looking. The effort was simple, a specific moment of attention, of actually seeing what was there rather than processing it as background. The view had given her 7 years of information about how things changed. She could say now, in this second week of October, the particular tree on the left turns first. In the third week of March, the garden begins to show green. She had this knowledge because she had looked, repeatedly and across the years. This seemed to her a model for attention more broadly. You had to look many times before you could really see. Story 31, the last story. She had thought about the seasons and what they meant to her, and she had come to think that the seasons were primarily a practice of attention. Not because the seasons required you to pay attention, they did not require anything of you, but because they were the most reliable teachers of change and continuity available to anyone. The year turned. The same things happened and were different each time. Summer arrived and was this summer, not last summer. Autumn came and was this autumn, with these leaves, this light, this particular quality. The practice was to meet the seasons where they were, to look at winter as winter, to give spring its full welcome, to attend to the particular quality of each particular year's version of each particular season. She had found this practice healing in a way that was difficult to explain, not because the seasons solved anything, because they kept showing her that change was the nature of things, that nothing stayed, that what was gone had also come around before, and would come around again in its next version. She looked forward to the next season. She looked forward to the next year's version of this season. She had more seasons ahead of her, and she intended to be present for them. The world would keep turning. She planned to be watching. Story 32, the pond in summer. The pond in the park had a different life in summer than in any other season. She had been watching it across 4 years, and summer was when the pond was most active and also, she had found, most rewarding to sit beside. The dragonflies came in summer, the large ones that hovered and darted with an improbability she never entirely adjusted to. The water lilies opened. The birds used the pond more actively. The reeds at the edges grew tall and moved in the breeze. She sat beside the pond on summer afternoons when she could. She brought nothing in particular, no book, no phone to fill the pauses. She sat and watched. The watching was the activity, not the waiting for something specific to happen. She had no particular expectations. The watching of what was already happening, the surface movements, the arrivals and departures of birds, the dragonfly's flight, the shadows of clouds moving over the water. She had found this quality of watching very different from her usual quality of attention, which was directed at things she was doing or trying to understand. This was watching without agenda. The pond did not need her attention. It was doing what it was doing regardless. She was there to witness it. This was enough. Story 33, the sound of rain at night. The sound of rain at night was one of the sounds she liked most in the world. and she had never been able to entirely explain why. The rain at night meant she was inside and warm, which was part of it. The contrast was pleasant. The rain outside, her warmth within. But it was more than that. The sound itself had a quality she found settling, the consistent, variable percussion of it against the window and the roof. It was not silence, but it was a sound that did not ask anything of her. She had slept well, for as long as she could remember, on nights when it rained. She attributed this to the sound more than anything else. The rain gave her something to listen to that was neither alarming nor requiring. It was simply there, doing what rain did, and she could rest against it. She did not wish for rain most of the time. She had her usual preferences for good weather. But on evenings when she was tired and the windows showed the beginning of rain, she felt a small, specific gladness. Story 34. The Hill. She walked to the top of the hill near her house approximately once a month, and the view from the top was never the same view. The same landscape, the same fields, roads, distant town, the line of the horizon, was different every time depending on the weather and the season and the light. She had seen the same view under every possible kind of cloud. She had seen it in rain, which was its own kind of beautiful. She had seen it in the kind of late afternoon light that made the whole landscape golden, and she had stood in that light for a long time, unwilling to leave. She kept going to the top of the hill because the view kept being worth the going. Not always dramatically, sometimes ordinarily, but the view from above was always, in some way, a different perspective on the familiar, and the different perspective, reliably, was something she needed. She had thought about this, the literal going higher, as a way of getting perspective. She suspected this was why people climbed things, not only for the achievement, for the view, for the moment when you could see further than the usual level offered. Story 35. What Nature Gives. She had thought about what spending time in the natural world gave her, and she had arrived at a specific answer. It gave her back a sense of proportion. Not in a belittling way, not the making small of her concerns by the comparative size of mountains and seas. In a more useful way, the reminder that she was part of something that was very old and very large, and that continued regardless of what she was managing or failing to manage. The natural world did not care about her concerns. This was not cold. It was, she had found exactly the right quality of thing to spend time with when she was too inside her own concerns. The world did not solve her problems. It simply offered a different scale, and the different scale gave her things back in right proportion. She made sure to spend time in the natural world regularly, not always dramatically. She did not have mountains or sea near enough for regular visits. But the park, the canal, the garden, the sky, these were available, and they gave the same gift in smaller doses. She used them. She found she returned from them slightly more capable than she had been when she went. Story 36. The Seeds. She had started saving seeds 3 years ago, which she had not expected to become something she cared about. The first saved seeds had been an experiment. The seeds from a tomato she had particularly liked, dried on a piece of paper on the windowsill, stored in an envelope marked with the year. The following spring she had planted them with low expectations. Most had germinated. The tomatoes had been good. She had expanded the saving. She saved seeds from the beans and the courgettes and the flowers she wanted to keep. She had begun, with the saving, to understand plants differently, as things that had seeds in them, that were in the process of making their next generation, that she was participating in by allowing them to complete the cycle. The saved seeds were also, she found, connected to people. The tomato seeds had come from a friend's garden originally. She had given seeds to her neighbor. The particular bean she grew had a history of hands it had passed through. Seeds moved between people, and the movement made a network she had not known she was part of. She saved what she could each year. It was small work with a particular pleasure in it. Story 37. The Woods in All Weathers. He had walked in the woods near his house in every weather and had found the woods genuinely different in each condition. The woods in summer were green and enclosed and warm, the canopy complete, the light coming through in columns. The woods in winter were open and structural, the bare branches making patterns against the sky, the light reaching the floor that was in shadow for 6 months. The woods in rain smelled of earth and wet leaf, and the sound changed. The rain in the canopy, the dripping onto the undergrowth. The woods in frost were hushed and white at the edges. He had walked the same path in the woods in all of these versions. The path did not change. The woods were different each time. He had found in the years of walking the same woods that familiarity was not the enemy of attention. He had feared this, that knowing the woods would make them ordinary. Instead, the knowing had made the changes more visible. He noticed what was different because he knew what was the same. This seemed to him the case with attention more generally. You needed familiarity to see change. The unfamiliar gave you novelty. The familiar gave you the perception of difference over time. Both were worth having. Story 38. The August Heat. She had never managed to fully enjoy the highest heat of summer and had eventually stopped trying to. The heat above 30 degrees was, for her, not the summer she wanted. She was less able to think, less inclined to move, looking forward to it being cooler. She had spent years feeling that she was failing at summer by not enjoying the hottest days, because the culture around her suggested that heat was what you wanted, and the hotter the better. She had stopped failing at summer and had simply acknowledged her preference. She liked warm summer days, the mild to moderately warm ones, the evenings after the heat had lifted, the long light of the northern summer evening. She did not like the extreme heat. She did not need to. She had found that accepting the preference had made the summer better. She had stopped trying to enjoy what she didn't enjoy and had spent more time in the parts of summer she actually liked. She had taken walks in the early morning before the heat built. She had used the hottest afternoons for indoor things. She had gone out in the evenings. She had had excellent summers since she stopped trying to have the summer she thought she was supposed to want. Story 39. The Year in the Garden. She had kept a garden journal for 1 full year, a simple record of what was happening in the garden each week, and at the end of the year she had read it back. The year had been, as years always were, fuller than she had remembered. The first crocus in February that she had been surprised by, as if she had not expected it. The late frost in April that had caught the early planting. The dry June that had required more watering than usual. The particularly good tomatoes in August. The first mushrooms in the corner she had not intended for mushrooms. The last rose of the year, in October, which she had also been surprised by. She had been surprised by the same things that had surprised her in previous years. This seemed worth noting. The rhythm of the garden returned annually in its approximate form, and yet she met each arrival and each passing with fresh surprise, as if she had not been through it before. She had not grown jaded. She thought this was the gift of the natural world. Specifically, the events repeated and remained, somehow, events. The first crocus was always the first crocus. She planned to be surprised by it next February. Story 40. The Last Story. She had paid attention to the seasons for most of her adult life, and what they had given her, she thought, was a different relationship with time. Not the clock time, the scheduled and accounted time of days and appointments. The other kind of time, the kind that was measured in flowering and fruiting and dying back and returning, the kind that moved in circles rather than lines. She found the circular time helpful as a companion to the linear time she mostly lived in. The linear time moved forward only, deadline after deadline, age after age, the accumulating past and the approaching future. The circular time moved forward and returned. Winter always returning, spring always returning, the same rhythm in the year and the year and the year. There was something in the returning that the linear time did not offer, the sense that things came back. Not the same things exactly, not without loss. But the returning was real. The seasons came back, the birds came back, the bulbs she had planted came back. The light returned after the dark. She found this steadying. The world was committed to its returns. She could count on them. She did. Story 41. The Simple Calendar. She had made, 1 year, a very simple calendar, 1 page per month, with space only to write one thing, something she had noticed in the natural world that month. The April page said, "The apple blossom earlier than last year." The July page said, "The long evening, the swallow still flying at 9 o'clock." The November page said, "The last leaves on the oak." At the end of the year, she had 12 observations. She had read them back and found in them the shape of the year. Not the events and appointments of the year, but the season of the year. The natural rhythm she had been living inside without fully recording. She had made the calendar again the following year. She planned to keep making it. She thought the 12 observations were a better record of the year than most of what she otherwise wrote down. And so we come to the end of tonight's journey through the seasons. You have traveled from the last days of summer to winter fog, from frozen rivers to falling snow, from the first green shoots of spring to the long light of midsummer night. You have stood in thunderstorms and on winter beaches, in bare oak fields and in barns abandoned by swallows. You have watched the world breathe in and out across a full year. All of it in English, all of it yours to keep. Language, like the seasons, comes to us gradually. You do not learn it all at once. It arrives in pieces, in layers, over time. A word here, a phrase there, a feeling that slowly becomes understanding. Trust the process. It is working, even when you are asleep. If you would like more stories like these, please subscribe to Cozy English. A new episode arrives every week. Share it with someone who is learning, a friend, a family member, someone who could use a quiet moment and a few hundred new words. Rest now. Let the language settle. Good night.